You're listening to the Just Japan Podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 185 of the Just Japan Podcast, everything you want to know about Japan. My name's Kevin O'Shea, and I'm the host of this weekly podcast that brings to you a lot of cool stuff about Japan. And this week, another awesome episode. A first-time guest, that's right. We're going to be talking to Mike, the man behind the Hanzai Podcast, True Crime in Japan. True crime, something a lot of us are interested in. True crime podcasts are something that are becoming a big deal these days. And there's a lot of great ones out there. And crime in Japan is a fascinating topic. And it's one that basically, if you can only read English and check out the English media, there's just a little dabble of it in the news for us to consume. But if you have the means and the ability to consume the Japanese media, there's a lot more out there to learn about. And Mike brings us that really neat news. That neat news about true crime in Japan. And this evening, we're going to talk to him about his new true crime podcast, Hanzai Podcast. Well, I want to thank all of you awesome people for downloading this episode of the Just Japan Podcast. Episodes have not been coming as frequently as I would like, but life gets busy sometimes and you just, unable to keep that weekly schedule. But hopefully we'll be back on track soon enough. But you guys are listening, so that's what matters. And I want to appreciate the fact that you guys are so awesome. Again, of course, you can find this podcast on all major podcatchers. Just do a Google search for Just Japan Podcast. And of course, you guys should be following me on Twitter at JLandKev. And of course, you should be checking out the Just Japan Podcast Facebook page over at facebook.com/JustJapanStuff. Yeah, guys, so it's spring now. The school year is winding down for me where I am. Just basically have about a month left of the school year, and then I'm going to be on summer holiday, and I will be heading to Japan for a few weeks at the end of June. Really excited about that. And to be honest, more excited about heading to Canada for the rest of the summer. Haven't been to Canada for summer in about 11 years. So this is going to be a very big deal for me. What are my plans? Well, for my time in Japan, my kids will be attending school. My daughter will go to a local kindergarten in Kobe, Japan, and my son will go to a local elementary school for a couple of weeks just to basically hang out with old friends and work on their Japanese chops. And then once they get to Canada for the remainder of vacation, it will be very much so vacation in kind of a smaller town in Ontario, where we're going to be doing a lot of stuff like camping, relaxing, and just hanging out with family and friends. So it's going to be wonderful. Again, the podcast is back this week. Really awesome episode. Very fascinating chat with Mike. Again, he's a first-time guest on the podcast, but he's someone who has a lot of experience in Japan and someone who is sharing a very interesting side of Japan with his new podcast. So let's learn more about the man and learn more about the podcast, the Hanzai Podcast. Folks, welcome to episode number 185 of the Just Japan Podcast, and we're going to be talking about true crime in Japan this evening, which is very cool. A topic that I don't think it's come up yet in 185 episodes, so this is great. And I would like to welcome first-time guest Mike Cash from the Hanzai Podcast. Mike, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's absolutely great. It's always good to get new blood on the podcast. And I tell you, folks out there listening, Mike popped up on my radar a few months ago because I'm always interested in finding new Japan podcasts. And yours came along. So before we jump into talking about the Hanzai Podcast, I was wondering if you could just tell the podcast listeners a little bit about yourself, where you're originally from, and why the heck you ended up in Japan.
Oh, I'm originally from Tennessee, and I ended up here courtesy of the United States Navy.
Okay. So was that a recent thing?
No. That was when I was young and had hair. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I myself am not that old, and I don't have hair either. But
Okay.
yeah. So I'm curious. How long have you been in Japan?
This is something you might want to edit out, but I don't give that information to fellow foreigners because it just complicates things.
Can I say you've been there longer than 5 years?
Yes.
Okay. All right. There we go.
I mean, at this point in my life, I've been like online doing stuff that so long, and everybody knows it's kind of ridiculous to keep it up.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a policy I've always had, because when I first got here, I saw people. I'm sure you've seen this too. You know, a guy just arrives in Japan and he says something or does something or asks a question or something, and somebody's, "Oh, how long you been here?" I've been here a month. Well, I've been here 2 months. Let me tell you all about this place. But you know, that phenomenon goes on forever, and I hated that so bad. I said,
true enough.
Yeah, if I'm ever on the long end of this, I will not do it. So.
Well, I suppose, you know, like I was in Japan long enough to meet a lot of people who had been there long term, people in there short term. You know, you meet like young people who end up in Japan who are just Japanophiles and want to learn a lot about the language and stuff, and they're like bragging to each other, like, how many kanji do you know? I know this many kanji.
Right, exactly.
Kind of like how much can you bench? You know, like in high school, kids talking about bench pressing. But at the same time, I suppose, you know, I was in Japan for like almost 10 years, and my Japanese is quite laughable. So I know that, for example, there's nothing more I love, being very sarcastic here, than people like, how long were you in Japan? You must be able to speak fluent Japanese. What? You can't speak fluent Japanese? I'm like, well, not, I mean, I'm like, my comprehension is really high.
I was at a barbecue one time a few years ago, met a fellow foreigner for the first time, and I had heard him telling other people, his wife was his translator for everything.
Okay.
And this was a mixed Japanese and foreigner, you know, barbecue. And she was telling people, oh, he's been here 13 years. I kept hearing this all through the day. And finally in the evening, I had a chance, you know, to talk to him a bit. And somebody asked him, you know, how long have you been here? He said, 10 years. And I said, excuse me, all day long I've heard your wife say 13 in Japanese. He said, yeah, my Japanese is so bad, I just thought I'd better trim it down to something more plausible. 10 and 13 is not that big a difference.
Yeah, true enough. You should have said 3 or 2. Yeah.
I've just always found it, you know, to be a really meaningless thing to tell somebody, because, for example, I know a guy that's been here, I think, 40 years or so.
Yeah.
And I think it's like last year he learned his first Japanese word, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
So and he is just clueless about everything. So it's one of the most meaningless things you can tell people. And if you tell people, they also sometimes feel like you're just using that to shut them down or beat them up.
Well, there are people who do that, right?
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
I mean, I think we've both come across people. We know, I'm sure
Absolutely.
We both know people who it's just a feather in their hat to, like, I've been here for 25 years, so I know more than you do, or I've been here.
I heard somebody once put it perfectly. It's like, you know, it's like being proud of being the tallest kid in the second grade. All you have to do is sit still long enough, you know. It's not an accomplishment, you know.
That's so funny.
Anyway, I saw so many people be rude or crude with that one when I was on the short end of it. I said, nah, I don't want to do that. I'm on the long end. So it's just easier just not to mention. If you don't say it's a long time, it's a long time.
Right on.
But cool. But I don't like to, you know, buttress my opinions with that or use it as a substitute for, you know, saying I know what I'm talking about.
So you've been in Japan for a while.
Yeah, a while. Yeah,
a while. You've been in Japan for a while, and you got there one way, and I'm going to assume you're doing something else now.
Yes, I'm a truck driver.
A truck driver.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. I think that you mentioned that before while we were chatting on Twitter and stuff. So that's interesting. That alone is a first on the Just Japan podcast. So you've been in Japan for a while. You're doing this and that, but the reason why you're here tonight is to talk about the Hanzai Podcast. So
yes.
This is, well, first of all, can you just tell us about the podcast? What is, for all of those out there who, now you guys out there who are listening, and I really appreciate it. I've been not as regular as normal with the podcast, but a treat for you. We've got more Japan content for you, and in the name of the Hanzai Podcast. So what is the Hanzai Podcast? Can you tell us about it?
Sure. Maybe for people who haven't recognized the name, or Hanzai is just the Japanese word for crime. I'm sure people who listen to podcasts know there are enough true crime podcasts out there, you know, more than you can shake a stick at. And I listen to quite a bit of them. You know, being a truck driver, I consume anywhere from 10 to 12 hours or more of fresh audio content a day.
Wow.
So I'm really a heavy, old time radio, podcasts and stuff. They've been a blessing, podcast coming
I
along.
was just going to say that. That must be something for you that is, because I mean, I myself, I don't have the free time I once had, but when I was commuting to work, when I was living in Japan, commuting daily, plus I used to be a marathon runner, so a lot of time on the road, and I like listening to podcasts. I could consume, several hours a day.
Yeah, if you need batches and batches and batches of something fresh, every day, yeah, podcasts really provide it for you.
Yeah.
But there's several different kinds. There's comedy, there's movie reviews, there's discussions of TV. There's all sorts of genres or types of content out there.
Yeah.
Crime stuff was like anybody else. Watch a little detective TV shows or stuff like it. It's an interesting
absolutely
thing. It can be, but I would find myself trying to listen to podcasts put up by comedians or current events and stuff from the U.S. where I'm from, and I couldn't relate to it because I've been away from it quite a bit, and I don't know who they're talking about or what they're talking about. They'll make a cultural reference to some pop culture thing, and I'm just sitting there with a blank look on my face. I'm like, who is that? Is that somebody, or is that your buddy at work? I don't know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
But with crime, hey, it's easy to tell you got good guys, you got bad guys, and they're going to tell you exactly who is who and who's doing what.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that you can, if you go back to the Bible, one of the first things, Cain rose up and slew Abel. And it's the only story in there that you don't need explained to you.
True.
Because even today, thousands of years later, and across all kinds of cultural divides, you can say, "Oh yeah, I get that one. Yeah, I see why he killed Abel."
Yeah, no, I was going to say there is definitely. I mean, there is a real kind of I don't know, a very basic, visceral kind of, I'm not sure what type of draw towards
it doesn't
crime
matter
stories.
Doesn't matter where you're from or what the time period was even. The reason people do things, greed, revenge, lust, whatever, that crosses cultural borders. It crosses timelines, everything.
Yeah.
So I didn't need to be up to speed on pop culture stuff to hear a story about Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy or any kind of a crime that was going on. It didn't have to be a famous one. And I started noticing, well, not just the stories from the U.S. where I'm from, podcasts out of Australia. The most popular one now is Australia. Some out of the UK, and I was listening to those. I thought, I've been to Australia, but not to the UK. I thought, I've never been there. But yeah, I get what they're talking about. I get what they're doing. The exact name of the city or the exact geography doesn't matter. If it does, I can go look it up, if I get a map. Then I got to thinking, yeah, well, maybe the Japanese stories would cross borders just as well if someone were telling the stories. So I look up on Google and everything, and I think I found one Japan true crime podcast that got abandoned last fall.
Yeah, I was gonna say, actually, that is I used to listen to them. That was the True Crime Japan podcast,
right?
Which I had. I mean, it was from what I know. I don't know the folks. I personally don't know them, but I'm on their Facebook group, and they had a pretty kind of passionate following. So,
yeah, I've as I was Googling around, I found lots of people really loved the show.
And I have to admit, I listened to it too, and I enjoyed it, but it just it went from once every 2 weeks to just kind of less regular. Once a month, once every 2 months, and then eventually, like you said, last fall, 2017, that was it.
Yeah, they had a problem with being two people doing it also. So
yeah, two people.
I think that can if one goes busy on something else or life happens, that leaves the other one holding the bag with nothing to do.
Exactly. That was, that's a formula. That's one thing that's come up on this podcast many times in the past when we talk about why I chose the model for this podcast that I have.
Right.
I don't want to do it by myself, because if I do it by myself, I'm eventually going to get, and for me, I'm going to get bored. But if I'm bringing on, I can't rely on having someone with me, beside me, physically in the room.
Right.
because of my life schedule and whatnot. Now that I'm actually not in Japan um, at the moment, but having different guests on, interviewing them,
Hmm.
perfect. There you go. And it's great for me because every week it's fresh. I'm interviewing people each week about something I have no idea about. So for me, it's like new information, right? So it's great. But yeah. So that's I'm sure maybe other reasons too. But so now, I mean, there's a vacuum, right?
Yeah. So I've got the field all to myself. It's just me.
Yeah. So the Hanzai podcast. So now your podcast
Hmm.
is when. Okay, well, first of all, when did the first episode come out? I mean, maybe not the specific date, but when did
End of February, I put out the first one.
of this year of
Yeah.
2018? Okay, so and you've got. I mean, from I have not listened to every episode, but I have listened to some of your episodes, like the kind of single
Hmm.
crime story ones, plus your the news.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about the two different types of show that you've got in your feed?
Okay. I was trying to appeal to essentially two different audiences who I thought would want two different things. There's a huge, true crime podcast fan base or audience out there.
Yeah.
Once you get noticed, who maybe particularly don't care anything about Japan,
Mm-hmm.
but would listen if they heard some historical case.
Yeah.
And then there's a huge foreign community in Japan, and people who are outside Japan are interested in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe don't care about hearing about some historical crime case, but are interested in current events, what's going on in Japan, what are Japanese people like, what do Japanese people do, what's their life like, and it's not all Pokemon and eating funny flavored Kit Kat and stuff like that. It's
It isn't? Oh, okay.
not that I can do. If you think about it, crime is something that you do that you hope nobody's looking most of the time. I
Yeah.
mean, it's you being you, and you hope, boy, I hope nobody sees me doing this. And
Mm.
that's raw. That's Japan for Japan domestic consumption. That's not stuff they want anybody inside or outside Japan to see them doing. Japan has a public relations image that it puts out of itself, a very a good one,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been very successful with that. And the pop culture stuff and the active tourist promotion stuff. But what do you guys do when nobody's looking? What are you robbing convenience stores? Are you beating your kids?
Mm.
Are you doing this other human stuff that the rest of us are doing?
Well, I mean, there's
And
just brings me right away. I think of the big story that's all around Japan right
mhm,
now, as of yesterday, with that 7-year-old girl being found, her body being found on those train tracks
right.
after being hit by a train, and then later they found out that that train didn't kill her; she was dead already.
She she'd been strangled, yeah, before she got put on the tracks. Yeah, I haven't
Yeah.
even covered that one yet. That's coming up next week probably.
Mm.
Unless I can look and find out that it's all in English all over the place, then I probably won't touch it.
It is. It is actually all over the place. It was all over Japan today. I just read about it and posted on my Facebook
Okay,
page.
then I'll probably give it a passing mention and keep on going.
Yeah, that's kind of like that's, and well, I mean, which leads to some other questions I'll ask you later on in the
Hmm.
interview. But this is, so there is an appeal. I mean, I have to admit that I'm a big fan of the Someone Knows Something podcast, which
Hmm.
is the one based out of Canada, the CBC Radio, the Canadian public broadcaster, put out. And I thought that one has really sucked me in. um, you know a few seasons have been better than others. A few really just kind of left me hanging, like, okay, so there we go, nothing solved. And
Right. I listened to the first two seasons, I believe, and some people have, mockingly on the internet called it nobody knew nothing or something like that.
yeah, well, I could see how there was the first season about the little boy who disappeared in the lake,
Yeah,
which
after all
I
that dragging in
which
the
ironic
lake and digging through the mud and everything, and then it was nothing. Sorry.
which I actually, ironically enough, and maybe you probably may not be aware of this, because I'm Canadian and I'm a big
Hmm.
Canadian news junkie. It was just announced
Right.
in the news last week that I believe the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are reopening that and are going to be doing another very thorough search of that lake for that boy.
Well, right.
But there you go. But there's no question marks, right? Um, and ironically enough, I now work with a guy who's from that hometown. which is really strange from that small town. Just weird coincidence. Okay. Did you ever, now over the years, you've been listening to podcasts,
Right.
you said as a truck driver, at any point before, creating the Hanzai podcast, did you think of jumping into podcasting? Were there any other did it ever cross your mind like, hey, I could do this, or maybe?
Yeah, after you hear enough podcasts, some of them are like really slick and really good, radio quality, like, got money behind them, production value and production teams. And some are like, wow, anybody with a microphone can do this. There's no barrier to entry, apparently, And,
Well, there isn't.
But some of them, you drop those rather quickly,
Yes.
because, wow, this sucks. I can't listen to this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, I of course I'd had that thought like anybody else, think, geez, anybody can do this. Could I do this? Yeah, I guess I could technically. Do I have anything I want to talk about? No, not really.
Okay. Yeah.
What am I going to do for content or a theme or
Yeah, that was like with me when I decided to make this podcast, and we're 185 in, and if I didn't miss weeks and have that big hiatus when I moved to Japan, I'd definitely be over 200 now. I'd probably like around 220, 230. But I mean, for me, it was a matter of, I'm like, okay, I can't do a podcast where I'm by myself, where I'm just talking about like what Kevin knows about Japan, because I don't know that much. I know my little world, right? My little world of being an international, like I'm an elementary school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I got 2 kids. I sometimes like to run. I enjoy a can of beer from time to time, and I like spicy food.
Well, in your case, I could imagine, deciding to set out on this, and there's no way that you could not have thought at the beginning, okay, at what point am I going to run out of material?
Oh, exactly.
You had to have that thought in your head.
And that's why I came up with a model. Number one, look at the name, Just Japan Podcast.
Right.
So like that literally, I could talk about anything. Like that's it. Like the topic is, I'm not pigeoned into something, because I mean, I'd when I was researching topics of podcasts about Japan and listening, there would be occasionally one would come out made by English teachers, and I'm not trying to disparage English teachers.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are awesome if you're listening. I'm sure some people are. But there would be like maybe a few English teachers who were new to the JET program would start a podcast about teaching English. And there was all this like inside baseball kind of talk about like all the lingo of being a JET or an ALT. And if you didn't know, I was never a JET, so I'm like, I have no idea what the heck they're talking about. Listening to some of these podcasts, I'd never taught in a Japanese public school, so I didn't I don't get this. And then after like they'd be there for a year or two, and then they're finished their contract and they leave, and then the podcast is done. So I didn't want to do that. And then I figured if it's just me, I'm going to run out of topics, but also I'm going to get bored personally. So if I can have a model where I can bring on different people each week, that's going to keep it interesting for me.
Well, that's another reason that I figured crime was good, because I also listen to a comedian named Pat Dixon who does a weekly show called New York City Crime Report.
Okay.
He takes a often very irreverent take on crime stories out of New York. He'll sit down with a guest usually, and he'll have prepared statements, and sometimes they'll just sit and riff on the stories. But the thing I picked up from that was, as long as you're using crime for your base material, whether you're going to go straight with it or comedic with it or whatever, you're never going to run out of material, because people are always going to be doing stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm covered on that. I mean, whether I decide to sit down and look up the historic episodes and research those and put those together or not, people are going to drop news in my lap every day. There's always somebody doing something stupid out there.
It's like are you familiar with Kevin Smith, the American movie director?
Only I've heard the name mentioned on podcasts.
He's been a podcast king for years. He's got the Smodcast Network, Smodcast, a whole bunch of podcasts. But him and his co-hosts on Smodcast, they had a little bit for years. It wouldn't be every week. It'd be like maybe once a month. It was called Scan BC, and basically there's a Twitter account that tweets out crime. It's like from like police scanners in British Columbia, Canada, and they bring it, and it's just like a comedy thing, because they joke about like crimes in Canada. How serious are they? And it's like, there's a man with a hockey stick smashing donuts in the middle of the road. Police are called to the scene. And it's like, these are actual like real calls. Right. And they just read the most ridiculous ones that, of course, make Canada look like such a silly country and this and that. But it's so entertaining.
I was afraid of doing something like that. You can do that here. And, I include stories like that in the news when they're there. But that's not my purpose to be like, oh, hey, look at Japan being silly, ha ha, he, they're doing stupid stuff. Because I include stuff like, recently a woman in Osaka went out to the fifth floor balcony with her 2-year-old daughter and threw the kid off. I can't get comedy out of that.
Oh God!
A woman down there took her newborn baby and dropped it in a septic tank.
Yeah.
It drowned in human filth.
Yeah.
There's nothing funny about that. No. I don't present it as being funny. But then you get stuff like there's a guy last week, 60-something-year-old homeless guy in Osaka. Not that that's funny, but he went into a convenience store around midnight, had a book in his hand, walked up to the 22-year-old clerk, whapped him on the head with the book, and held up a cell phone charger and said, "This is a bomb. Don't call the police. Give me the money." And he had done nothing to disguise the cell phone charger. I mean, any 22-year-old looks at it and said, dude, that's a cell phone charger. He just held him there till the cops came and took him off.
I heard that one in the last week's episode. Yeah.
That's funny. I don't have to go out looking for that or include that just to make, Japan's quirky,
Well, okay.
So the guy did it. I didn't ask him to go do it. It's in the news. Everybody in Japan could see it. All I did was put it in a different language.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Okay. So then, how do you go about researching the podcast? So I mean, obviously, you've already mentioned, it's if it's something that's going to be in the English media, Japan media, you're probably not going to cover it. You also mentioned about translating. So obviously, you're at a point in your Japanese where you can go through the Japanese media, the Japanese news, and and pull the stories out and translate them in English. So how do you go about finding all this stuff, all these stories?
The current news stuff, I go through a news collating app on the iPad.
Okay.
Go through there every day. There'd be hundreds of stories, and I go through searching headlines.
Okay.
Anything crime related, then I'll go in and select, copy and paste, and move it all into a text file.
Okay.
So that takes me probably, 30, 40 minutes a day just to collect and collate all of the
because I mean your podcast is quite like that kind of, I don't know what to call it, a crime roundup. But that kind of news one, that's quite exhaustive. You cover a lot of material there.
Yeah, because I want to give a fair overall look at it. Like I said, I'm not just searching for something to make you giggle about Japan or make you shocked about Japan. This is a fair representation as best I can of what's actually happening, what's going on. There'll be trends and stuff,
Yeah.
It might be something incredibly mundane and stupid, or it might be, okay, here's an update on something that happened or reported a month ago. They dropped the charges, or it's proceeding to trial, or just something a little update from what we had before. I take the news part, seriously. Not that I consider myself a reporter or anything like that. I get the text files, I put those all together, then maybe a couple days a week, when I have an hour or two at a time, I'll sit down. I don't translate them per se, because that would be ripping them off, plagiarism, even if you change languages. But use the facts from those, and sometimes I'll have 2 or 3 stories about, from different sources about the same event.
Okay.
And collate them and rewrite them, rearrange them enough that it's not just, doing the equivalent of reading a wiki page. It's a podcast,
Yeah.
Some people do that. That's how I do the weekly news crime roundup. For the historical cases, I'll go through, I've been reading Japanese criminal justice or true crime books. I started reading those back around 2000 or so, I guess.
Okay.
So, before I started podcasting, I had a long background of reading things about the police.
So you're interested in true crime, right?
Yeah. And I would, there's nothing like that out there really in English, very little in English about those kinds of stories. So I've got, a big stack of books and a lot of stuff that I've read. And I said, well, okay, the crime news will keep me always in fresh material, for the ongoing stuff. And I've got stuff I can dig through to go look for historical cases. And the internet helps out a lot filling in the gaps, because you have to go back and check, well, was there any later development on this, or what other kind of amplifying information can I find? And it gives you extra sources, or sometimes you can find some images that weren't in the books or whatever that I have.
Okay.
So I'll some of it's from reading Japanese books, some of it's from reading around on web pages, pulling that all together and trying to get a story out of it. And often for people maybe who don't live here or don't have that much knowledge about a particular aspect of Japan or location, I'll try to flesh it out with a little bit of background information, whether it's something local about the area or about the period of time or something to give a little more context to put it in.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's, I mean, there's a lot of, I think a lot of work would have to be put into something like that. Like I myself, for example, I think of, would me, Kevin, be able to put together some kind of podcast like this? Maybe I could put an episode or two together, but because of the fact that I don't have the Japanese reading ability, I don't have the kanji background, it would be, I wouldn't be able to do the research to put something like this together. So I definitely, it's for you guys out there, Japan fans and non-Japan fans, maybe who are crime fans or crime and Japan fans, you're going to appreciate this because it's definitely an interesting, source of crime news. Now, I'm curious. And you kind of have alluded to some things earlier about how, you don't want to make this like, oh, look how weird Japan is, or look how wacky it is.
Right.
And I mean, you do hear of bizarre crimes and weird things, but you also hear of those horrible things like you mentioned, like a woman just chucking her kid off a balcony or dropping her kid in a septic system. And you do hear these really, just horrible things that you would hear of in any other country, child abuse and things like this. So what I'm wondering is, would you, again, I'm throwing this out there. You've already basically answered the question, but do you think that like the way, maybe not the way crime is dealt with, but I guess you've consumed enough of this to know, do you think the police deal with things differently here in Japan than maybe in other countries or America? Or maybe do you think the news media covers things in a different way than they are covered in America or Canada?
Both.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me, talk to me, tell me some more about it.
The police here, I mean, you can always hear foreigners griping about, Japan's a police state, and the police are racist, and the police are ousting me for this and that, and I was on my bicycle, and
by the way,
Yeah.
I've always thought that is a load of BS.
It is. It's a total load of BS.
Because, I lived in Japan for 10 years, never stopped by a cop. Yeah.
I've had interactions with police quite a bit, and I've never found them to be anything except professional, courteous, and competent.
Actually, I'm gonna backtrack. I have been stopped a couple of times, and exactly what you just said.
I've had cases where I've been stopped, and then there have been cases where from me I would call them, contact them, or whatever, and need to be in proximity to them. And if you're not being a jerk, they're not going to be jerks.
And it tends to be like that around the world, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people come to Japan and they're like, for the first time, they're in a minority often.
Yeah, true.
Especially when we talk about, I'm white. We're talking about white people. They come here, and oh boy, finally I'm a minority and I get to act outraged and offended about something, any little thing. So they stopped me on my bicycle and they weren't checking the the example I always give is, man, you know what? Every time I go to McDonald's, they hand the bag to a white guy. Well, yeah, of course they do, because I'm the white guy who ordered something from them. I'm the one they're having business with right now. It's just as stupid to say I'm a white guy riding my bicycle and a Japanese cop stopped me. Therefore, he did it because I'm a foreigner. No, he did it because you're riding a bicycle.
and lots of Japanese people steal bicycles, and they want to see if your name and ID matches the registration on that bicycle.
I work in the equivalent of a duck blind. For people who don't know what that is, you go duck hunting, you hide in something so the ducks don't see you when you get ready to shoot them. Mm-hmm. I can sometimes park along the side of the road, for whatever reason, taking a break or whatever. And people don't notice me sitting here. They don't know that, a foreigner is sitting in the truck 99.9% of the time. And I've sat many times and watched the police doing bicycle checks in areas where there are no foreigners passing by, and they're pulling over Japanese left and right, and giving them the same hassle.
Yep.
The image or the crap about the racist cops and they did this to me. That's 99% BS. You're going to find one guy somewhere who does something, but as a general thing, no.
My only story of being stopped by the cops, and it's a brief one. I was stopped last spring, about almost a year ago, riding my bicycle home from work. I cycle commuted for 3 years in Kobe, Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and I got stopped on this dark bridge by 2 policemen. They stopped me and they asked me to get off my bicycle. They were the politest guys ever. They tried their best to use English, even though I could communicate with them in Japanese. And they looked at my ID. They looked at the registration on my bicycle, which was my bicycle, so it was registered to me. They called it in to the police station, and they asked if the names matched up. It did. They said, thank you very much. And before I could even leave, they stopped a Japanese guy right behind me and got him to get off his bike. And the same thing, I'm sure, happened to him.
Absolutely.
So I did not in any way feel like, I can't believe that. It's like, they were just like, we got a quota to meet, guys. And we got to, we're going to stand here and try to catch people, maybe.
The people who complain that they're not being treated equally because they got stopped on a bicycle, if you think about what they're actually asking for is special treatment. You shouldn't have stopped me because I'm a foreigner. I should have been not stopped because I'm a foreigner. Well, then you're not asking for to be treated equally because they're stopping everybody else.
That's a good point, eh? That's a good point. So I mean, okay, so there's that whole thing, and if you've been in Japan for any amount of time, you hear that. Even if you're new to Japan, or before you even get to Japan, you'll hear some of this kind of BS about the police treating. But have you, again, in that research, have you found? I mean, I don't know. I think recent news media, you hear a lot of negative stuff about law enforcement in North America, the way things they deal with crime or not crime, I should say. How a lot of law enforcement officials basically become criminals themselves with the way they deal with things. But in Japan, like with investigations and stuff like that, does it seem really different?
Yeah, I think it is. I just tweeted, I think yesterday or day before, maybe. I live in a country where you forget that the police have guns. When I first got here, not all of them carried guns. That was the thing that came about after I got here.
Okay.
And they carry revolvers. I mean, what cops in the world carry revolvers anymore? 5-shot revolvers.
Yeah, they're 5-shot ones, aren't they?
And they don't carry reloads.
So they've got 5 rounds.
Yeah, American cops have like a 17 or 18 shot automatic and with a couple extra clips on them.
Yeah.
And maybe an assault rifle in the trunk of the car and a shotgun.
Yeah.
Of course, guns aren't a problem here, but it's so nice. That's a huge difference. You don't worry about getting shot by a cop here ever. It's news if a cop pulls his gun. Never mind shoots anybody. If he pulls his gun, there was a case last week. I think I reported on it. Some guy came out of his house with 2 knives. He called the police himself about something. They went to check on him. He came out with a knife in each hand, and the cop pulled his pistol and leveled it on him and told him to drop his weapons. But his partner with the expandable police baton went up and knocked the knives out of the guy's hands with the baton. I mean, I thought, man, they would have shot you. You'd been dead already in the U.S. when you came out running, didn't stop with the knives. They would have blam, blam, blam. They would have emptied 2 pistols on you and reloaded. But here, no, they just, and the cops don't wear bulletproof vests. Why would they? That's so nice they don't wear those. It's nice to live in a country where, that's not a thing.
Yeah, true.
They're not worried about getting, I think in the whole history, since like the Meiji era of modern policing in Japan, there have been fewer than 200 policemen killed on duty. In the course of in America, it's like, dozens every year?
And I'm sure most of those were probably in traffic accidents and things like that, right?
Yeah, there are some of those, yeah. But, that has to make a big difference in the way that they're going to interact with the people that they're policing. When you don't have that kind of thing, when you do a traffic stop, you don't walk up with your hand on the butt of your pistol ready to pull out and shoot somebody who, I was just going for my wallet. Well, I thought you were going for a gun. Bam, bam. And then it's huge. And if there's different races involved, you got a whole national blow up that goes on forever. I mean, here we don't have that. That's a huge difference already right there. Even if you do think they're racist, you certainly can't make the case that they're going around killing everybody, whether it's true or not, because that just ain't happening. They're not giving us any reason to even try to make a case about something like that. So that's a huge difference. And then if you want to move on to the media, the difference in the media, Here, often they don't include names.
Okay, yeah, true.
Not always. Sometimes I leave names out that were actually in the stories because I don't want to overload my podcast with Japanese proper nouns.
Okay, yeah.
Whether it be place names or personal names, because if people aren't that used to hearing Japanese, it just sounds like blah, 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 and then blah, blah. You lose people. So people, oh, I know Tokyo, I know Osaka, maybe I know Kobe. Okay, if I mention any place else in Japan, you're going to just sit there with a blank look and stare at the speaker, or and I'm going to lose people. So I'll include a place name. Sometimes I'll include a person's name. Not always.
Okay.
But oftentimes the original news story didn't include it. And oftentimes, a quirk of Japanese is that they'll have they don't give plurals and singular distinction in Japanese. So sometimes it's not clear when I'm going through the article, was this one guy or two?
Oh, okay.
One guy or three? And yeah, sometimes it makes it a little hard when you're trying to convert the story over to English, because we need to be more specific about stuff like that.
I was just thinking, actually, speaking of different differences between crime investigation. If you have the time, and for all you guys out there listening, if you've never listened to episode number, and I'm pretty sure I'm pulling this out of my brain right now, episode number 11 of the Just Japan podcast. That's the first episode where I had Brian Waters on. Brian lives in Fukuoka, and Brian on Twitter is my2yen. And Brian is a forensic pathologist who teaches at a major university in Kyushu. He teaches forensic pathology, and he worked for the LA County Coroner's Office as I'll say air quotes, he won't let me say this, a CSI agent. Kind of what the closest thing to it. I think I did a clickbaity title. I was like CSI in Japan for that episode. But he was saying that there was a big difference in with crime in Japan versus America, since he worked for the coroner's office, was that all that CSI work is done by the police or by the coroner's office, whereas in Japan the police collect all that they collect all the samples and the evidence, but they don't analyze it. They send it to a local university, where they have a crime lab where, like, Brian works at, and they analyze it there at the university, which is kind of neat.
There's Dr.
I'm probably going to be corrected by that, but
yeah, no. I was going to say there's one guy who's on TV quite a lot. He's quite old now. Can't think of his first name. Dr. Ueno, I think, who for years, for maybe 30, 40 years, was the official coroner for Tokyo.
Okay.
And of course, Tokyo has enough. The rule in Japan is if you've not been under the care of a physician within 24 hours of your death, then it's ruled a suspicious death, and the coroner or somebody has to sign off on the death and whether to do an autopsy or not.
Okay.
And this guy, he did thousands of autopsies in Tokyo, and he's written several books about the subject. Now, I've read maybe 4 or 5 of them, and he said that in all of Japan, like, forensic pathology was like just a complete desert wasteland. He said there's like 3 of us that do it as a full-time job in Japan, and which has to really affect investigations of stuff. He said usually it's somebody at the medical department at a prefectural university who maybe does maybe 1 or 2 autopsies a year, if that. And so that has to affect the quality, because if you get a forensic pathologist who does stuff every day and working with police cases and known suspicious deaths every day, of course he's like any other field of work, you've got to pick up all kinds of knowledge and expertise on this that you can look at something. Oh, wait, something's off here. That maybe a guy who's like just running his clinic or teaching medical school every day might not immediately pick up on or be on the alert for.
Of course, yeah. And
of course, those books, it was several years since I read them. There may have been some changes since then, but I can't imagine there's been huge changes. And like I remember I listened to the episode with your friend. University hospitals often get the call, and where was a place recently that was doing an autopsy? I think it was Osaka, somewhere around there. And where they did it was in the police garage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, they just move stuff out of the way and set up some lights, and then the doctor did it there, I thought, wow, you don't actually have facilities for that. They've got more full-time forensic pathologists on TV shows now than actually work in the field in Japan.
There's probably more from actually just literally from CSI Las Vegas itself. Than
I mean, Japanese shows that are out now. There are 2 or 3 out now that cover that, and I think in actuality, the last number I heard was there were 3 actual full-time doing police forensic pathology work for investigative stuff. Everybody else was like, call the medical school.
I'm really curious to hear. I know, Brian, you're out there, you're listening. I want to hear what you have to say about this, or what your thoughts are. I would like to get your feedback. Maybe we can bring both of you guys on sometime and talk about this. Hey, so the Hanzai Podcast, it's new. It's been out for a few months, and I'm curious, where do you see the podcast going? Are you planning on doing? Now, I have to admit, I'm gonna be the first to admit, I've listened to a few episodes. I haven't listened to all of them. The historical crime podcast episodes. How often do you plan on putting those out, if possible?
I had hoped to put those out once a week, but I don't think that's going to be possible to maintain.
A lot of work involved, eh?
Man, this whole thing is more work than I thought it was going to be.
Yes, it gets that way, doesn't
it? It takes, seriously, because I'm one person. I'm working cross language, and everything's scripted. Everything has to be put together beforehand.
Yeah.
I think it takes me roughly, for about, like, whether it's a news or a historical, to make about a 20-minute or so episode is about 10 hours of work.
Yeah, I mean, that I can imagine that. Obviously, like this episode here where we talk, I do a little bit of jot down a few notes, send them off to you. We talk for an hour or so maybe, and then I'm going to do some recording on my own later, another day. And then I think for me, now that I've been doing this for so long, I would say from end to end, getting everything online, pushing it out there, most 3 hours.
Yeah.
But I'm not doing research. Well, no, actually, I'm gonna backtrack on that a little bit, because if I am bringing on someone who I don't know, or someone who has a podcast that I'm not familiar with, that involves me going out for a lot of walks at night, listening to the podcast,
right?
Going out on a Saturday, maybe for a walk when the kids are doing something. My kids are doing something. My kids are 7 and 5, so and listening to something. Or if it's a blogger, I am spending time reading their blog,
right?
Because I need to get a vibe of what they do. So I can't just be like, hey, I don't know what you do. I need to spend a good chunk of time reading. Maybe I because I spread it out, I don't think about it that way. But yeah, often there is probably more time. I mean, it could be anywhere from 5 to 6 to 7 hours per episode. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how much it can be, and I certainly didn't before I tried, doing it. And my working hours is something out of a Charles Dickens novel. I work seriously easily 12 to 14 or more hours a day, 6 days a week, and that doesn't leave a whole lot of time to put in extra 20 hours on a side project.
Yeah.
So the news stories, that's not something you can just set by the side and let go, because that stuff's flowing by every day, and you're going to miss something big or interesting or an update on something that you've already put out. So that's got to be kind of collected in. The historical stuff, yeah, I'd really like to put it out once a week, but in all truth, it's probably going to turn into every 2 to 3 weeks. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to turn out.
It makes sense, though. I mean, that's just when it's something is that research intensive, and then you've got to get all that research and organize it, lay it out, script it out, and then record it.
Yeah, and I've heard so many poorly researched podcasts. I would listen to somebody just talking stuff, pulling out of their rear end. I think, I know this off the top of my head, and why don't you know that? And you presumably prepared for this, and you don't know some basic information that's, you're wasting my time. I don't want to waste the listener's time. You're giving me, not everybody has, 10 hours a day they need to fill up the podcast. Some people got 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And if you're giving it to me, I don't want to waste your time with it. So I've got to put in that time to find something, get my facts, make sure they're straight, not just pull it out of my head. I'll go back if I'm doing a historical episode, like one I did was out of 1930 something, whatever. It involved do investigations through post offices and stuff. And I thought, well, I wonder how many post offices were there in Japan in 1930, whatever. And I spent the time to go look that up. It was 12,938. I think it was off the top of my head that the police could have had to go to, to trace down a certain package. This is information that would be nice to know, if you're going to get a context for the story. Well, I'm not just going to say, oh, there were hundreds or, oh, there were thousands. That's lazy. I'm going to try to find out the fact from an actual historical source. And, I got to go diving and find that stuff.
Yeah.
And it takes time to go do that. And sometimes it'll be an hour or two spent to find one little fact that probably 99% of listeners won't even notice that I put in there. They'll just, glide right by it. And that's okay. But still, it takes that time.
Yeah. No, I get you, man. To be honest, a trip down memory lane, it's no longer on there. It's no longer out there. But my first podcast ever was back in 2008. I did a Canadian history podcast called Looks Like Canada. And I did, I think, a whopping 12 episodes before
I've heard you talk about that.
Okay, before I gave up. Because it was just like, And I also, And I also was using a service where I didn't get any kind of like analytics or demographics. So I didn't even like, did anyone listen to this week?
I'm sitting here talking to myself.
Yeah. and I did like I remember like things like, I went to university in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. I did an episode with the Ottawa jail. It was like an 8-minute episode. It took me like 4 hours to put it together.
Right.
Like to do the research, to write it up in a doc, edit it, and then read it like I think probably like 10 times before I was happy with the take. And then finally edit, put it up, and it's just like, well, there it goes. I think at the time it was like Squarespace.
Right.
Squarespace.com. They had a new feature where you could upload like podcast or audio files to Squarespace.
Right.
So I'd upload it. It was like, well, there it is. Hope someone's listening to it. And then eventually
you just made me think the absolute, for anybody out there listening, all this talk about, doing a podcast, can I do one or whatever? The main thing I learned, the absolute hardest thing about starting a podcast, and I think this has to apply to everybody in the world, is getting over hating the sound of your own voice when you go to edit the thing. I think probably that's why a lot of people don't edit. They just put it together, and man, I don't want to hear myself talk, and they just throw it out there.
And in the case with me, it was I was a YouTuber for many, 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 many years before I started a podcast. So I might argue, some may argue that I was already so in love with myself.
Well, you're a professional educator, so you're used to to speaking in public or in front of groups of people, even if they are 7 or 8 years old.
No, but I
know you do other stuff.
No, but you're right. You're right. I've been a teacher for like 16 years, 17 years, and when you're in my position in my career, I don't just do a lot of teaching for children. I do lots of professional development work. I do lots of performances. I mean, presentations. Same
right.
For adults and stuff. Yeah, of course. I've been doing this for, and to be honest, I actually have a background in theater and arts and stuff. In university, my minor was drama. I did and I was a competitive public speaker in university, and I did like debating and all that. So I've never been shy.
But human nature is, I don't care who you are, the first time you hear your voice played back.
Yeah.
Is that what I sound like? Oh God, I hate that, because you're hearing yourself for the first time ever in your life. And especially hearing yourself for the first time going on and on and on for 15, 30 minutes or an hour. And you think, Jesus, and I can't put this out. Then you have to realize, okay, by this time in my life, I have met and talked to thousands of people, and none of them had that reaction to me, not to my face anyway. So apparently, my voice is something at least bearable to other people. You have to have that in mind. Okay. And yeah, the first several episodes when you're going through
True.
and trying to edit, you think, man, God, I hate my voice. I hate.
Well,
my
I mean,
finally, you just you tune it out and just go, to get the edit work done.
I myself wince when I listen to the first few episodes of the Just Japan podcast because I was using a Skype headset mic,
Right.
and I'm just like, well, the audio is crap. It's just, it sounds so bad. And that was actually the first few comments I got in the first few episodes. People were like, it doesn't sound good. And I was like, all right, got to save up my pennies and buy a microphone.
Yeah, that's another thing I had from listening to so many podcasts for several years that I know, okay, don't be too harsh on anybody's first several episodes.
Yeah, their first maybe even 10 episodes or
so.
So.
If you're checking out somebody who has a deep back catalog and you listen, you think, oh, this guy sucks, I hate this guy, don't do that. Check out his first one or two if you want to, but if he's been going for a while, get one of the most recent ones and see if he still has those habits that you can't stand. Because probably he's worked out of them by then.
Absolutely.
Give him a chance. If he hasn't, unsubscribe, drop him, keep on going. There's tons of other stuff out there. But yeah, don't ever judge a podcaster or a podcast by the first 3 or 4 or 5 episodes.
Because you know what, when that podcaster is new and they're in those initial episodes and there's a lot of
you're pretty much guaranteed. You're guaranteed to suck,
and you're guaranteed and you're guaranteed that a lot of snarky people sent them comments and messages about their ahs, and buts. And they were very aware of that. And again, if they're now up to episode 250, I bet they sound a lot better.
One would hope, yeah. I've heard a few that that I've gone in and checked the later episodes, and I think, okay, I still can't stand what you're doing. I'm sorry. It's just
yeah, nice.
It happens.
It happens. Okay, well, you know what? I'm curious. For those out there, all the awesome Just Japan podcast peeps who are listening to the show, where can they find the Hanzai podcast? Where can they find you on social media? Just spray us like a fire hose. Tell us where all your stuff is.
Oh, the podcast is mainly through wherever you get podcasts, Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, all those things. It's on there. Or if you don't have one of those, I can't imagine you wouldn't. We're listening on the podcast. Mm-hmm. HanzaiPodcast.com. The content is there. You can listen, through a web browser. I have a Twitter at Hanzai Podcast, which I started using for the show promotion, but anymore I use it for things that end up annoying people, I think. Mostly, my main activity online is on a site called Japan Reference, www.jref.com. It's an old-fashioned forum that's been around for a long time, but I think people are disappearing, going to Facebook. It's all things Japan, language, culture, whatever. People get on there and talk about different things, ask questions, share information, and whatever. Mm-hmm. I'm on there quite a bit. Like I post under my name, Mike Cash. So
nice.
I'm easy to find there or anywhere else. Actually, that's the main place that I can be found.
Nice. So guys, Hanzai, which is HANZAI, Hanzai Podcast. Just type that into Google, like Hanzai Podcast, and boom, a bunch of stuff pops up.
Yeah, don't type in Japan Crime. You get that other podcast that's abandoned. I've not been able to knock them out of the Google ratings yet.
Not yet. You'll get there. Which that was a podcast that I enjoyed. It's a shame that they're not around anymore. But now we have a new podcast filling that void for all of us who love the true crime stuff. So Hanzai Podcast is now filling that void. So just go to Hanzai Podcast, do a search for that, or again, iTunes, Stitcher, HanzaiPodcast.com, at Hanzai Podcast on Twitter, right?
Right.
Go check them. Go check out. Not them. I don't know. It's this bizarre thing. I seem to I refer to myself as we. That I'm a podcaster. It's like I have a production team or something.
The editorial we. I've had to really resist doing that myself.
I do that. I do that all the time, and I don't know. Thanks for following us at the Just Japan Podcast. I mean, us as me. Maybe I could include my wife for tolerating me doing this. I could include my children for not coming into my bedroom where I record this. I don't know. They're part of the team. We'll say
Yeah.
that. The support.
Anytime I use we on the podcast, I mean me and the person listening, not the podcast
I suppose.
itself. Yeah.
Then again, I suppose I do have guests. So there we go. That could be the part of the we. But hey, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh, it was a pleasure, absolutely. And for all of you out there listening, Japan fans, crime fans, go out there, subscribe to the Hanzai Podcast ASAP. You won't be disappointed. Lots of interesting stuff. You got some new Japan content, folks. There you go. I'm supplying you with that. Well, I'm not. Mike is. I'm just pointing you in this direction. So, yeah, again, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Sure.
The number you have dialed has been changed. The new number is... Please note, the new number is...
All right, well, I want to thank Mike for taking the time to stop by the Just Japan Podcast and tell us all about the Hanzai Podcast. So, of course, guys, we got a new podcast on the scene. I want all of you to go out there and subscribe to the Hanzai Podcast. I mean, if you're listening to the Just Japan Podcast, you've got an interest in Japan, obviously. So if you're interested in cool and interesting crime stories about Japan, crime news about Japan, true crime Japan, go check out Hanzai Podcast. At the moment, it's the only crime podcast out there. There was, of course, we mentioned in the podcast while we were talking in the interview portion about the True Crime Japan podcast, which was a show that I really enjoyed myself, but it's just not around anymore. So, which is a shame, but there's something else for that space right now. So check out Hanzai Podcast, hanzaipodcast.com. Just do a Google search, go to iTunes, search or Stitcher, whatever it may be, and search for Hanzai Podcast, and go follow him. Go check it out, guys. Go do it. All right, guys. Well, this is actually the second time I've had to record this bumper. Not really a bumper so much as an ending, an outro. I accidentally, while editing this week's podcast, deleted my original end part, which is a bit frustrating, but what can you do? You just re-record it. So yeah, that's it for another week of the Just Japan Podcast. I'm losing my voice right now after a long week of teaching, so it's good to get this out right now. Remember, please follow me on social media. Follow me on Twitter at JLandKev. Go check out the Just Japan Podcast Facebook page over at facebook.com/JustJapanStuff. Of course, the home of the podcast is justjapanstuff.com. Go check it out. Yeah, that's it, guys. That's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to another week's episode of the podcast. We'll be back more frequently, more often than we have in the past couple of months. Sometimes life gets in the way of things like podcasting, but when life slows down a little bit, we have time to sit down and smell the daisies and podcast. Something like that, anyway. All right, guys. So, Kevin coming to you from Beijing, China, talking about Japan. Looking forward to a trip to Japan very soon and all of that, guys. Hey, wherever you are in the world, hope you're happy, hope you're healthy, and I will be talking to you real soon.